You know how some days you just feel bombarded with like all this bad news about climate change, right?
Hmm.
Well, get ready for a dose of hope because today we are diving into Climate Sisters, Resisting Ecocide.
Yes.
And this book shares stories of over 100 young women who are leading the fight against climate change around the globe.
Yeah, it's truly inspiring to see a book highlighting this demographic, really, because these are the voices that are often, most impacted by climate change.
Totally. And so often they are left out of the conversation, so it's so important to be highlighting their stories.
Absolutely. And I think what's really powerful about this book is it moves beyond just giving a voice to the voiceless. It's about recognizing that these young women are already agents of change. They're not waiting for permission, they're taking action.
Exactly. And it's not just about giving them a seat at the table, it's about recognizing they're already flipping the table, you know?
Yes, exactly.
But before we get too far ahead of ourselves, let's take a step back for a second and unpack why focusing on young women in the context of climate change is so essential.
Absolutely. One of the key things to understand is that climate change isn't some abstract threat, looming in the distant future. It's a lived reality for millions, especially women and girls around the world.
Yeah.
I mean, imagine being a young girl in a region where droughts are becoming, more frequent, more severe. Suddenly something as simple as fetching water, right? Which, is a task that often falls on women and girls, that becomes a day-long trek.
Wow.
And that has a ripple effect. It impacts your education, it impacts your health, your entire future.
It's like this domino effect.
Exactly.
And it made me think about the Uturi Warmi, the indigenous women in Ecuador that are on the front lines. And, they're literally patrolling for illegal mining in their territories to protect their ancestral lands.
Right.
And the book talks about how that environmental destruction directly leads to water contamination, which then, of course, most severely affects women and children.
Absolutely. And it really underscores how climate change intersects with so many other social and economic issues. It exacerbates existing inequalities and often is women who are left to deal with the fallout.
It's true. And it's easy to kind of fall into the trap of thinking, oh, well, that's happening over there. But, even in places that we consider developed, those same vulnerabilities exist. Like you think about a place like Miami, which is already grappling with sea level rise. And when those floods become even more frequent and intense, who's going to be hit hardest? It's going to be those low-income communities, often with women-led households, who don't have the resources to just pick up and move.
Exactly. It's not just about geography. It's about systemic inequalities that are being amplified by climate change.
It's like this double whammy.
Exactly.
And this brings us to another really important point, and that is that while climate change is this, massive global issue, the solutions, the approaches, the challenges, they're all shaped by these really specific local contexts.
Absolutely. Yeah. And that's actually what I found so refreshing about this book, right? We're moving beyond these kind of like singular figures. That Greta Thunberg, as important as her work is,
Right.
we're hearing from activists who are often overlooked by Western media, whose stories aren't being told.
Totally. It's about recognizing that what works in Sweden might not work in Indonesia.
Precisely.
And so with that in mind, we deliberately chose three very different activists from the book to really highlight this diversity of experiences. We've got Licypriya Kangujam from India, Sasina Kaudelka from Thailand, and Salsabila Khairunnisa from Indonesia.
Three very different contexts, three very different approaches to activism,
For sure.
but all united by this common thread of, demanding climate justice
Exactly.
and fighting for their future.
Okay, so let's start with Licypriya. I was honestly blown away by her story. I mean, this girl started protesting outside of India's parliament when she was 6 years old. 6.
It's
It
incredible.
just blows my mind.
It speaks to a very real sense of urgency, I think, that, young people, particularly in countries like India, are feeling. They're growing up with these, the impacts of climate change are all around them.
Totally. And, India is facing these extreme heat waves, these devastating floods. It's no wonder she's taking a stand.
Right.
Plus, India is one of the top greenhouse gas emitters in the world.
Absolutely.
So there's this added pressure, this sense that they have this huge role to play in like global climate action.
Absolutely. And what I find interesting is that Licypriya's approach really initially focused on holding her government accountable, calling out politicians, demanding they take action, which makes sense given India's democratic system.
Yeah.
But, remember that time when she kind of called out the media for constantly comparing her to Greta?
Oh, yeah. She was basically like, I'm not Greta. I have my own story.
Exactly. Like, don't try to fit me into your narrative. I have my own fight. I have my own story. I think that's so important for us to remember. These aren't just, faces of a movement. These are individuals with their own unique stories and perspectives and experiences.
100%. And speaking of unique perspectives, let's move from the bustling streets of Delhi to the beaches of Thailand, where we meet Sasina Kaudelka. Now, Sasina's story, really resonated with me because it's all about taking action, right where you are at a local level.
Right.
Her work with Trash Hero, it's not about changing laws or protesting big corporations. It's about actually getting your hands dirty and cleaning up beaches and inspiring your community to do the same.
It's a really fantastic example of, how change can happen from the ground up.
Mm-hmm.
And it's especially relevant in a place like Thailand,
Yeah.
where tourism, is a vital part of their economy.
Right.
But it also contributes, significantly to the plastic pollution problem.
Totally. And I remember reading that Thailand is one of the world's biggest contributors to ocean plastic.
Yeah.
And what really struck me about Sasina's approach is it's not about, guilt or blame.
Right.
It's about empowering people to make a difference.
Exactly. And, she's actually quoted in the book saying, we motivate people by our positivity.
I love that.
We do it because it makes us feel good in ourselves to be giving back to nature.
Mm-hmm.
It's really about, finding that joy and purpose and taking action, however small it might seem.
And that really comes across in her story. There's this infectious optimism, this belief that even simple acts like picking up trash can have this ripple effect.
Absolutely. And, it's interesting to kind of contrast Sasina's approach with Licypriya's.
Okay.
Because you have these two young women who are, both deeply passionate about the environment, but their strategies are totally different.
Yeah.
And it just shows that there's no one-size-fits-all solution.
Right.
What works in a democracy like India may not be the most effective approach in a country, with a more complicated political landscape.
That's such a good point. It's about understanding those nuances, the cultural context, the political realities on the ground. And that brings us to our third activist, Salsabila Khairunnisa from Indonesia. Her story, to me, felt, I don't know, the most complex in a way because it deals with the palm oil industry, which, let's face it, it's something that most of us probably interact with every day and don't even realize it.
It's ubiquitous.
Totally.
Yeah, it's in everything from, food to cosmetics to, even biofuels.
Yeah.
And, for many communities in Indonesia, palm oil production is a lifeline.
Right.
It's a major source of income.
Right. But then there's the deforestation, the habitat destruction, the impact on indigenous communities.
Absolutely.
It's such a tough issue.
It's really a double-edged sword.
Totally. Yeah. And what makes Salsabila's work even more challenging, I think, is that so many people in Indonesia don't necessarily connect human activity to climate change.
That's true.
There's this perception that it's this far off problem.
Yeah.
It's not affecting me.
Yeah. It's happening elsewhere.
Exactly. So she's not just fighting for, the environment in general. She's fighting to change mindsets.
Right.
To make people understand that connection between their daily lives and, the planet's health.
Absolutely. And she has this incredibly powerful quote in the book. She says, "Our rainforests are not just resources to be exploited. They are our life and future."
Wow.
So she's really trying to shift that narrative,
Yeah.
To make people see the rainforest not just as these, economic assets,
Right.
but as essential for their very survival.
Yeah. It's crazy, right? Like you said, they're from totally different parts of the world. But they're all connected by this really deep care for the planet.
It's true. And that actually brings up a really interesting point about the book as a whole.
Okay, what's that?
Even though, you have all this incredible diversity of backgrounds and approaches,
Yeah.
there are these recurring themes that unite these activists.
Okay, so what are they? What are those common threads that we're seeing?
Well, for one, it's young women leading the charge.
Of course.
And often they're doing so, in the face of apathy or even outright opposition.
Yeah.
Not just from governments and corporations,
Really?
but sometimes from their own communities,
Mhm.
which is really interesting.
That's got to be tough. I mean, that takes some serious guts
Yeah, absolutely.
to stand up for what you believe in when it feels like everybody around you is just whatever.
Exactly. And what I think is particularly interesting is that it's not just about government action for these activists.
Yeah.
It's about holding corporations accountable too.
Oh, for sure. And And we hear so much about how just a handful of like massive companies are responsible for this huge chunk of global emissions.
Absolutely. And these young women are on the front lines. They're witnessing the effects of that firsthand.
Yeah.
So they're organizing boycotts. They're launching these really savvy social media campaigns.
Wow.
Some of them are even taking legal action against some of the biggest polluters on the planet.
It's like they're done waiting for permission to make a change.
Exactly.
They're just like, we got to do this ourselves. And there's this really palpable sense of urgency, wouldn't you say?
Absolutely. They're not sugarcoating things.
Yeah.
They're living with the impacts of climate change.
Yeah.
And they know we don't have time for half measures.
Yeah. It's not all doom and gloom, though, right? Like, there's still hope in these stories.
Oh, absolutely.
There's this belief that, like, we can create a better future if we act now.
Exactly. And that's what makes this book, and I think the whole movement so inspiring, is that these young women are fighting for a livable future.
Yeah.
For themselves, and for future generations. And that's such a powerful message.
It is. And I think it's a message that we all need to hear right now.
Oh, great.
Reading this book for me was like this, I don't know, like a jolt of energy.
Yeah.
Just a reminder that even though we're facing this like massive challenge, there are people out there, young people, who aren't giving up.
Yeah.
And that gives me hope.
Me too. And the book, it really is just a starting point. It celebrates these incredible individuals.
Yeah.
But it got me thinking, what if we could like weave all these stories together into this one like collective narrative?
Yeah.
What if there was a way to like share their successes more broadly, share their strategies, offer support on a global scale?
Wow, yeah.
And just amplify their impact even more?
That's an amazing thought. And that is actually a great question to leave our listeners with today.
What do you think that would look like?
Yeah, what would a truly interconnected global movement for climate justice actually look like? What kind of power could it unleash?
I love that.
So, listeners, that's something to think about. We just scratched the surface of Climate Sisters today. There are so many more stories to discover.
I know, it's such a good book.
So if any of this resonated with you, go check it out. You'll meet even more incredible women who are fighting for our planet, and hopefully you'll find as much inspiration as we did. Until next time.